14 elite warriors lay dead in the snow. Not killed by an army. Not killed by a rogue alpha. Killed by one desperate Omega, a woman who wasn't supposed to survive, let alone fight back. When the Alpha King heard the news, he didn't order her execution. He ordered her capture, alive. What he found wasn't just a survivor. It was something far more dangerous. This is the story of Briar Hayes, the Omega who rewrote the rules of power. If this story hit you differently, don't just scroll past it. Hit subscribe. These are the stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. 14 elite warriors of the Iron Peak Vanguard lay dead along the Blackwood border. Their bodies scattered across the frozen ground. They hadn't been tracking some rogue army. They'd been hunting one person, a desperate Omega who had somehow broken them all. When the news reached Alpha King Zodiac Croft, his command was swift and absolute. Bring her to me. Alive. The Great Hall of Highreach Keep was normally filled with booming voices. The clash of tankards. And the thick, oppressive weight of alpha dominance. But tonight, silence pressed down like a physical force. The hearth fires crackled and hissed, throwing restless shadows against the ancient stone walls. Zodiac Croft stood at the head of the scarred oak table, both hands pressed flat against its surface. At 32, he'd spent the last decade violently uniting the Northern Territories. He was a tactician first, a ruler who governed with cold logic and an iron fist. He didn't tolerate failure, and he certainly didn't tolerate the sight bleeding onto his stone floor right now. Braddock, commander of the Iron Peak, Vanguard Zodiac's most feared enforcers, was on his knees. His left arm hung at a grotesque angle, bone pressing visibly against torn leather armor. Deep, jagged claw marks raked across his chest, slicing clean through the thickest part of his chainmail with terrifying precision. He was gasping, choking on his own blood, held upright only by 2 fortress guards. 14. Zodiac said. His voice was low, vibrating with restrained fury that made every lord and general in the room go rigid. I sent 15 of my finest warriors to clear out a squatter camp of rogues near Oakhaven Crossing. You returned to me alone. Braddock, explain. Braddock coughed a wet, rattling sound. An ambush. My king, but not from an army. It was a single wolf. A ripple of disbelief moved through the hall. Silas Bickett, Zodiac's beta and chief strategist, stepped forward from the shadows. A single rogue alpha took down 14 of the Vanguard. Impossible. Even the legendary beasts of the Frostlands couldn't manage that without dying in the process. Not an alpha. Braddock wheezed, his eyes still wide with the kind of terror that doesn't fade. He looked up, meeting Zodiac's icy gray stare. An Omega. Sire. A female. The silence that followed was absolute. In their world, Omegas were caretakers, peacemakers. Their biology made them smaller, their temperaments naturally submissive to avoid conflict. An Omega taking down even one trained warrior was a biological anomaly. Taking down 14 was something out of a nightmare. You're delirious from blood loss. Braddock, Lord Harrington, a sniveling noble from the southern Riverlands, scoffed from his place along the wall. An Omega, she would have submitted the moment you bared your fangs. She didn't bare her throat. Braddock snarled, a sudden flare of anger giving him strength. She tore ours out. She didn't fight with brute strength. My king. She fought like a ghost. She used the terrain deadfalls, traps, the freezing mud of the riverbank. When she shifted, she didn't go full wolf. She stayed in a half shift, human cunning with wolf speed. She lured my men into the narrow gorge at Blackwood Ridge and slaughtered them one by one. She smelled like rain and crushed pine, a pure Omega scent, but she had the killing intent of a starving predator. Zodiac didn't dismiss the claim. He walked slowly around the table, his heavy boots echoing against stone. He crouched in front of his broken commander and studied him closely. He could smell the truth radiating off Braddock. No deception, only profound shame and raw. Visceral fear. The political climate of the kingdom was fragile. The Southern Lords, led by men like Harrington, were already whispering of rebellion, questioning Zodiac's iron grip. If word spread that the king's elite guard had been decimated by a single low-ranking female, it would shatter the myth of his pack's invincibility. It would be the spark in a room full of gunpowder, but beyond the political catastrophe, something darker and far more primal stirred in Zodiac's chest. Intrigue, fascination, an Omega with the tactical brilliance and lethal instinct to dismantle an elite squad. She was a living weapon, a genetic impossibility he needed to understand. "Where is she now?" Zodiac asked, his tone deathly calm. "She stayed behind to guard the crossing." Braddock whispered, "She was buying time for the rest of the rogues, the sick, the pups to cross the River Trent. We broke her leg. I think she couldn't have gone far." Zodiac stood, his presence filling the cavernous hall. He turned to his beta. "Silas, assemble 30 men. Light armor. Tracking hounds. Silver nets." Lord Harrington stepped forward, his face flushed. "My king, surely we're just going to execute this feral creature and mount her head on the gates to restore the Vanguard's honor." Zodiac's eyes locked onto Harrington, flashing a dangerous, luminous gold for just a fraction of a second. "Honor is a luxury for peacetime. Harrington, this kingdom runs on power. If there's a wolf out there capable of rewriting the laws of our nature, I won't let her rot in the mud." He looked back at Silas, his voice echoing off the stone walls, final and absolute. "Hunt her down. I don't care how many men it takes. But listen carefully. Whoever lands a lethal blow on her will answer to me personally. The Omega who took down half my warriors, I want her brought to me alive." The pain was a living thing gnawing at Briar Hayes' thigh. She huddled beneath the rotting roots of an ancient, overturned cedar tree, packing the deep wound with damp moss and crushed yarrow. Her hands, covered in dried blood that belonged entirely to the king's men, were shaking violently from adrenaline and the biting cold of the northern wind. Briar was 22. Though the harsh life of a hunted rogue made her feel centuries older, she wasn't supposed to be a killer. By all biological mandates, she was an Omega, her scent naturally calming, her instincts wired for nurturing and pack cohesion. But biology hadn't accounted for Cassius. Cassius had been a rogue alpha, exiled from the southern courts for treason. He'd found Briar orphaned at the age of 10, and recognizing a fierce, stubborn spark in her hazel eyes, he'd decided to train her. "They'll expect you to submit, little bird," he'd told her, day after day, year after year, as he threw her into the mud. "Use their arrogance. They fight with pride. You'll fight for survival. Pride bleeds. Survival doesn't." Cassius was dead now, killed by the king's patrols 3 winters ago, but his lessons had kept the Oakhaven rogue camp alive. Until yesterday, Briar leaned her head against the frozen dirt and closed her eyes. She'd done it. She'd held the Vanguard off long enough for the elders and children to cross the freezing currents of the River Trent. They were safe in the neutral territories now. She'd paid for it with the lives of 14 men who'd thought she was easy prey, and now she was paying for it with her own body. Her left leg was badly fractured, and she had a deep laceration across her ribs. A low, resonant howl echoed through Blackwood Ridge. It wasn't the wild, chaotic howl of a rogue. It was synchronized, disciplined. Trackers. Briar's eyes snapped open. The king hadn't just sent another patrol. He'd sent a hunting party. She forced herself to move, biting down on a leather strap to muffle her own screams as she bound her leg tightly with torn cloth and a sturdy branch. She couldn't outrun them. Not anymore. But she could make them bleed for every inch of ground they took. 3 miles away, Silas Beckett rode on horseback, leading a pack of 30 heavily armed trackers through the dense pine forest. Silas was a meticulous man. He didn't share Harrington's disdain for the Omega. He shared Zodiac's clinical curiosity, He read the tracks in the snow like a grim manuscript. She's dragging her left leg. One of the lead scouts noted, pointing to a distinctive groove in the snow beside the boot prints. She's losing blood. We'll have her before nightfall. Don't underestimate her. Silas ordered sharply, his eyes scanning the dense canopy above. Commander Braddock warned us. Keep your eyes off the ground and on the trees. She doesn't fight like a wolf. She fights like a gorilla. His warning came seconds too late. As the vanguard of the tracking party passed beneath two massive oaks, a sharp snapping sound echoed through the quiet forest, the sound of a taut rope giving way. A massive, spiked deadfall log, suspended 20 feet in the air and concealed by pine boughs, swung down with terrifying velocity. It smashed into 3 warriors, throwing them from their horses and crushing their chests instantly. Chaos erupted. The horses screamed, rearing up in panic. Ambush defensive formation, Silas roared, drawing his broadsword from the shadows of the ridge. A throwing knife whistled through the air, burying itself in the throat of the scout who'd just spoken. Before the body even hit the ground, a figure dropped from the lower branches of a nearby spruce. Briar didn't give them time to organize. She hit the ground in a fluid roll. Already in her half shift, her fingernails had elongated into vicious obsidian claws, her teeth into jagged fangs. Yet she retained her human balance and mobility. She moved with a desperate, terrifying grace. She ducked under a sweeping sword strike from a massive warrior, slashing her claws across his femoral artery in one seamless motion. Then used his falling body as a shield against a crossbow bolt. Let her use the silver, Silas bellowed. Realizing the sheer feral speed of the woman before him, she was moving too fast for conventional weapons. And Zodiac's orders echoed in his mind. Alive, 5 warriors rushed forward, throwing heavy mesh nets laced with pure silver. Briar dodged the first 2, vaulting off a boulder and driving her knee into the face of a third tracker, shattering his jaw. But her fractured leg finally gave out. She landed wrong, a blinding flash of agony shooting up her spine. She stumbled, and in that split second of hesitation, a silver net came crashing down over her. The metal sizzled against her skin, burning her exposed flesh. Briar screamed a harrowing, guttural sound as she thrashed against the weighted mesh. She fought like a trapped wildcat, snapping her jaws at the hands trying to pin her down, tearing the leather gloves off 2 men before Silas finally stepped forward. He brought the heavy pommel of his sword down hard against the side of her head. The world exploded in white light, then faded into a dull, throbbing gray. Briar collapsed into the snow, chest heaving, the silver burning her skin. But she forced her eyes to stay open, glaring up at Silas with pure, unadulterated venom. Silas stared down at her, breathing heavily. He looked at the 4 men she'd just incapacitated in less than 60 seconds despite a broken leg and exhaustion. He crouched down, studying her blood-streaked face, noting the delicate, aristocratic structure of her cheekbones beneath the dirt and gore. "You're a nightmare," Silas murmured, almost with respect. "Bind her in heavy iron. Sedate her with wolfsbane if you have to. We ride for Highreach immediately." For 2 days, Briar drifted in and out of a feverish, drug-induced haze, trapped in a reinforced iron cage on the back of a horse-drawn wagon. Every jolt of the wooden wheels sent fire through her broken leg. She knew where they were taking her. Highreach, keep the slaughterhouse of rogues. She mentally prepared herself for the executioner's block, hoping it would be quick. When she finally woke to full consciousness, the wagon had stopped. Freezing rain was coming down in sheets. Coarse hands grabbed her chains, dragging her out of the cage and throwing her onto the hard, unforgiving cobblestones of a massive courtyard. Briar coughed, spitting blood onto the wet stones. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, refusing to lie flat. The heavy iron chains rattled around her wrists and neck. Slowly, she forced her head up, hair wet, matted hair clinging to her face. standing at the top of the grand stone staircase, flanked by towering guards and the glowing torches of the fortress, was Alpha King Zodiac Croft. He was imposing, dressed in dark leather and heavy furs. The sheer aura of his dominance rolled off him in waves that made the surrounding warriors bow their heads. It was a pressure designed to force an Omega to their belly. Briar felt the crushing weight of his alpha aura commanding her to submit. Her instincts screamed at her to expose her throat. Instead, she gritted her teeth, tasting copper, and forced herself into a kneeling position, her spine straight. She looked up past the guards, past the rain, and locked her hazel eyes directly onto the king's glowing gray ones. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Zodiac stared down at the battered, chained woman in his courtyard. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead. For a long, moment, the entire fortress held its breath. Slowly, a dangerous, fascinated smirk touched the corner of the king's mouth. Checkmate, his eyes seemed to say, but Briar's glare responded with a promise. The game hasn't even started. The dungeons of Highreach Keep were legendary for their cruelty. Carved deep into the granite bedrock of the mountain, Briar fully expected the air to turn damp and smell of rotting straw as the guards dragged her by the chains through the fortress corridors. Instead, the air grew warmer. The brutal stone walls gave way to rich mahogany paneling and tapestries depicting ancient northern victories. The guards didn't drag her down into the dark, they hauled her upward, climbing a grand spiral staircase until they reached the king's personal wing. They threw her into a massive, opulent bedchamber. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the lock tumbling into place with a deafening clack. Briar lay on the plush, hand-woven Persian rug, her chest heaving, the silver burns on her skin weeping. The room smelled overwhelmingly of cedarwood, cold mountain air, and the sharp, ozone-like scent of a dominant alpha. It was Zodiac's scent. She was in the king's territory, locked in a gilded cage, before she could attempt to drag herself toward the heavy, iron-barred windows. The door clicked open again. An elderly woman bustled in, carrying a large wooden case. She was followed by two massive Vanguard guards who took up positions by the door, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. "I am Beatrice," the woman said, her voice a no-nonsense clip that brokered no argument. She set the case on a heavy oak table. "I'm the chief physician of Highreach. If you try to bite me, child, I'll let the silver rot your flesh. And I'll set your broken leg without a drop of milk of the poppy. Do we understand each other?" Briar glared at her, her hazel eyes flashing with feral defiance. But she remained silent. Survival meant knowing when to fight and when to conserve strength. Right now, she was bleeding out on a rug. She gave a single, stiff nod. For the next 3 hours, Beatrice worked with ruthless efficiency. She neutralized the silver burns with a poultice of crushed wolfsbane and river clay, muttering under her breath about the barbarism of the Vanguard. Setting the fractured femur was an agony that made Briar see stars. But true to Cassius's training, she didn't scream. She bit through her own lower lip, swallowing the copper taste of her own blood, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of a velvet armchair. "You have the pain tolerance of a warhorse," Beatrice murmured, wrapping the leg tightly in linen and splinting it with polished ashwood. "And the bone density is unnatural for an Omega. The old texts speak of the Carpathian bloodline's isolated packs in the deep eastern mountains who bred Omegas not for peace, but as stealth assassins. I thought it was a myth to frighten pups. I'm from the Riverlands." Briar rasped, her voice hoarse and raw. "Not the Carpathians. Biology doesn't care about geography." "Girl," Beatrice replied, packing her tools. "Rest now. Or try to." The room fell silent as the physician and guards left, locking the door once more. Briar dragged herself onto the massive, fur-lined bed, exhaustion finally pulling her down into a dark, dreamless void. She woke hours later to the feeling of being watched. The hearth fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the window was King Zodiac. He was no longer wearing his armor. He wore a simple, dark tunic that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. In his hand, he held the throwing knife Briar had buried in the scout's throat 2 days prior. He was turning it over, examining the crude, hand-forged balance of the blade, Defiant, her pulse immediately kicking into overdrive. She tried to push herself back against the headboard, but her splinted legs screamed in protest. "Don't tear your stitches," Zodiac commanded. It wasn't a request, it was a low, vibrating alpha tone designed to compel obedience. Briar gritted her teeth. Purposefully ignoring the compulsion, she leaned forward instead, resting her forearms on her knees. "Have you come to finish the job, Your Grace, or just to gloat?" Zodiac looked up, his striking gray eyes locking onto hers. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating. But Briar refused to break eye contact. 14 men. "Briar?" he said quietly, using her name for the first time. "Silas gave me the field report. You used the terrain. You used our own arrogance against us. It was a tactical masterpiece. Who taught you? Hunger. Briar bought back. And a desperate need not to be collared and bred by men like Harrington." Zodiac's jaw tightened. "Don't confuse me with my southern lords. Harrington is a fool who confuses cruelty with strength. I deal in order. And you're a chaotic anomaly. An omega with the kill count of a veteran executioner." He stood up slowly, stepping toward the bed. "Who taught you the Carpathian nerve strikes, the half-shift?" "A dead man," she answered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Cassius. Your patrols ran him down 3 winters ago for the crime of hunting on your so-called lands." Recognition flared in Zodiac's eyes. Cassius the Exiled, the rogue general. So the old ghost took a feral pup and turned her into a weapon. He paused. Standing over her, he leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of him wood smoke and dangerous power was overwhelming. "Where is the rest of your camp?" Briar let out a dark, breathless laugh, baring her teeth. "They crossed the Trent 2 days ago. They're in the neutral territories. They're out of your reach. Zodiac, you can torture me. You can hang me from your battlements. But you lost. I won." For a long moment, Zodiac just stared at her, the defiance radiating from this broken, battered omega was staggering. It ignited something fierce and entirely inappropriate in his chest. "I know," Zodiac said softly. Briar blinked, thrown off balance by the calm admission. "What?" "I recalled the border patrols," Zodiac stated, straightening up. "I let them cross the Trent. Your elders. You're sick. Your pups. They're safe in the valley of Oakhaven." "You're lying," Briar whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You execute rogues. I execute threats," Zodiac corrected, his voice turning cold and authoritative. "A camp of starving refugees is not a threat. You, however, are a liability I can't ignore. You bought their freedom with the blood of my Vanguard. Briar, a life for a life. They're free." He stepped back toward the door. "But you belong to me now. You'll heal. And then we'll see exactly what Cassius built." 3 weeks passed. The harsh northern winter settled over Highreach Keep, burying the courtyard in 3 feet of snow. Briar healed with the terrifying rapidity of her werewolf blood. Though the severe bone fracture required her to use a heavy, silver-capped mahogany cane Zodiac had provided, she wasn't a prisoner in the traditional sense. She was allowed to roam the upper levels of the Keep, the library. The inner gardens always shadowed by 2 Vanguard guards. The whispers in the corridors were deafening. The nobility summoned to Highreach for the Winter Solstice Council treated her like a leper. The Southern Lords, led by the increasingly venomous Lord Harrington, viewed her presence as a direct insult to the Alpha hierarchy. An Omega who killed warriors. It was unnatural. It was a disease that would spread to their own submissive packs if left unchecked. Zodiac, however, kept her close. He forced her to attend the strategic war councils, ordering her to sit quietly in the corner. He was testing her. He would purposefully present flawed tactical maps of the western mountain passes. Waiting to see her reaction, Briar would clench her jaw, her eyes lingering on the obvious supply line vulnerabilities Harrington would suggest. Zodiac saw it all. He was using Harrington's incompetence to gauge Briar's silent brilliance. The tension finally snapped on the night of the solstice banquet. The great hall was a riot of color, wealth, and excessive indulgence. Roasted meats, overflowing wine goblets, and the clatter of silver filled the air. Briar sat at the far end of the high table, dressed not in the ragged leather she'd been captured in, but in a tailored gown of deep forest green velvet, a silent mandate from Zodiac that she represented the crown now. Not the mud. Harrington had been drinking heavily. His face was flushed. His alpha scent was souring with aggressive arrogance. He stood up, silencing the musicians with a wave of his hand. "My king." Harrington slurred slightly, holding up his golden goblet. "We celebrate the solstice. We celebrate the strength of Highreach, yet we dine with a feral dog. A rogue Omega who slaughtered true-blooded soldiers. Is this the new standard of the Vanguard? Are we to take tactical advice from a breeder?" The hall fell deathly silent. Silas Beckett, sitting to Zodiac's right, subtly rested his hand on the hilt of his dagger. Zodiac didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Watch your tongue. Harrington, the wine is making you brave, but it's making you stupid." Harrington sneered, slamming his cup down. "I speak for the southern packs. We won't be mocked by this anomaly. She should be put down, or put to work on her back where she belongs." Before Zodiac could rise to snap the Lord's neck, Briar pushed herself up from the table. She leaned heavily on her mahogany cane, the silver cap gleaming in the firelight. She didn't look angry. She looked utterly, devastatingly bored. "Lord Harrington," Briar said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "you command the Riverwatch garrison. Do you not?" Harrington puffed his chest out. "I do. The finest archers in the south. Then why did you position your supply wagons in the mudflats of the lower basin during the monsoon season last month?" Briar asked, tilting her head. "You lost 3 tons of grain to rot and stalled your own cavalry for 2 weeks. A pup with a sandbox understands drainage better than your generals." A stifled laugh erupted from Silas, quickly covered by a cough. Zodiac sat back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. Harrington's face turned a mottled purple. "You and Salon. I may be an Omega." Briar cut him off, her hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous golden light. "But if you give me 10 men and a map, I could take your precious Riverwatch garrison before you even manage to pull your boots on. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." The hall erupted in hushed, shocked whispers. Harrington looked like he was going to lunge across the table, but a single warning growl from Zodiac pinned him to his spot, trembling with rage. Harrington turned and stormed out of the great hall, his sycophants trailing behind him. The banquet resumed, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken threats. 2 hours later, Briar retreated to the quiet sanctuary of the keep's library. She needed escape from the overwhelming scent of meat, vina, and aggression. The guards stood outside the heavy oak doors, leaving her alone among the towering shelves of ancient texts. She was tracing the spine of a leather-bound history of the Carpathian Wars when her sharp senses picked up a microscopic sound, a soft click from the servants' passageway, hidden behind the eastern tapestry. Then came the scent. It was masked with heavy cologne, but beneath it lay the metallic tang of fear and unsheathed steel. Briar didn't turn around. She kept her breathing perfectly even, relying on the reflections in the polished glass of a display case. A figure stepped out of the shadows, dressed entirely in black, holding a jagged, poisoned stiletto. It was one of Harrington's personal guard. Harrington hadn't left the keep. He'd ordered an execution. The assassin lunged. Aiming for the space between her ribs, Briar pivoted with lightning speed. She didn't have her claws, and she couldn't shift in the restrictive velvet gown. But she had Cassius's training. She brought the heavy mahogany cane up in a brutal, sweeping arc. The silver cap shattered the assassin's wrist with a sickening crack. The poison blade clattered to the floor. The man grunted in pain. Swinging a wild left hook, Briar ducked under it, ignoring the sharp pain in her healing leg, and drove the point of her cane directly into his solar plexus. As he doubled over, gasping for air, she brought the knee of her good leg up, smashing it into his face. He collapsed onto the stone floor, unconscious, bleeding profusely from a broken nose. The library doors burst open. Zodiac and Silas rushed in, swords drawn. Having heard the scuffle from the corridor, they froze. Taking in the scene, the assassin lay in a pool of blood. Briar stood over him, breathing heavily, straightening the ruffled sleeves of her green velvet gown. She leaned calmly back onto her cane. Looking up at the Alpha King, Lord Harrington left his garbage in the library. Briar said, her voice remarkably steady, "You might want to have it swept up." Zodiac looked from the unconscious, highly trained killer to the battered Omega leaning on a cane. The political facade fell away entirely. The danger Harrington posed was real. But in this moment, Zodiac realized the true danger was the woman standing in front of him. She was magnificent. He sheathed his sword. Taking a slow step toward her, the air in the library grew impossibly heavy, charged with an electric tension that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the intense, undeniable gravity pulling them together. "You are a menace?" Briar Hayes. Zodiac murmured, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, possessive heat. "I told you." "Your Grace," Briar whispered back, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "Pride bleeds. Survival doesn't." Zodiac didn't call for the guards immediately. He stepped over the groaning assassin, his eyes never leaving Briar. The heavy mahogany cane in her hand was splintered at the base. Stained with the blood of a man twice her size, he reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently wrapping around the head of the cane, sliding over her knuckles. The touch sent a jolt of electricity up Briar's arm. "You're bleeding," Zodiac murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He traced a line of crimson trailing down her forearm where the poisoned stiletto had grazed her skin. The scent of her blood, wild, sweet, and laced with adrenaline, hit his senses like a physical blow. The alpha in him roared, a primal demand to protect, to claim, to destroy anything that dared harm her. "It's a scratch." Briar breathed, refusing to break his gaze, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Harrington's a coward. He sends foot soldiers to do a lord's work." Before Zodiac could reply, the deafening toll of the Highreach warning bells shattered the midnight silence. The heavy iron clapper struck once, twice, 3 times. "Und Ziege." Silas burst back into the library, his face pale, a bloodied broadsword already in hand. "My king, the southern lords." Harrington didn't just storm out of the banquet. He gave a signal. A mercenary company of 500 men was hiding in the Pine Barrens. "They've breached the lower courtyard. They're using wolfsbane gas." Zodiac's expression hardened into a mask of pure, lethal fury. The political dance was over. This was treason. Secure the king's vault. He barked at Silas. "Put Briar inside. 2 guards on the door. If anyone but me tries to enter, kill them." He turned to leave, but Briar's hand shot out, grabbing his forearm. Her grip was startlingly strong. "No," she said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "If they have the lower courtyard, they control the gatehouse winches. They'll open the main portcullis and let the rest of the rebel army in. The vault is a tomb. I won't DNA cage. You're injured. And you're an Omega. Zodiac snarled, the glowing gold of his wolf pushing to the surface of his eyes. You'll do as I command. I took down 14 of your Vanguard with a broken rib and a prayer. Briar shouted back, stepping into his space, completely immune to his alpha aura. Harrington's mercenaries fight in phalanxes. They're rigid. If you meet them head-on in the courtyard, the Wolfsbane will choke your men before they can shift. You need to drop the secondary iron grates in the western corridor and funnel them into the armory choke point. Zodiac stared at her. In the span of 3 seconds, she'd analyzed a siege she couldn't even see and formulated a flawless counteroffensive. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a prodigy of war. Zodiac unbuckled a beautiful, silver-etched dagger from his own hip and pressed it into her hand. If you die, Briar Hayes, I'll drag you back from the underworld myself. Just don't get in my way. Your Grace. She smirked. Spinning the dagger expertly in her grip, chaos reigned in the lower levels of Highreach Keep. Thick, noxious yellow smoke rolled across the cobblestones, burning the eyes and lungs of the Vanguard defenders. Harrington's mercenaries, wearing heavy iron masks, advanced in a brutal shield wall, thrusting silver-tipped pikes forward. Zodiac didn't hold back. He hit the courtyard like a god of war, shifting mid-air into a monstrous, midnight black wolf. He tore through the mercenary lines, snapping pikes with his jaws and tossing armored men aside like ragdolls. But the Wolfsbane was taking its toll. His movements grew sluggish, his breathing ragged. From the high balcony overlooking the eastern wing, Lord Harrington watched the slaughter, a triumphant sneer on his face. Hold the line, he screamed to his men. The king falls tonight. He never saw the shadow drop from the stone gargoyle above him. Briar landed soundlessly behind Harrington. She ignored the burning agony in her healing leg. She didn't bother shifting. She didn't need to. In one fluid, brutal motion, she kicked the back of Harrington's knees, sending him crashing to the stone floor. Before he could cry out, she had Zodiac's silver-etched dagger pressed deep into the soft, pulsing flesh of his throat. Call them off, Briar whispered in his ear, her voice cold and hollow, or I'll paint this balcony with your aristocratic blood. Harrington froze, his eyes wide with stark terror. The feral Omega had bypassed his entire guard. He felt the sting of the blade breaking his skin. Yield, Harrington shrieked, his voice cracking in panic. Stand down, all men. Lay down your arms. The command echoed over the courtyard. The mercenaries, seeing their paymaster at the mercy of a single bloodied woman, hesitated. Silas and the Vanguard seized the moment, disarming the front line. The rebellion crumbled in a matter of seconds. Down in the courtyard, the massive black wolf shook the yellow dust from his fur and shifted back into the imposing, naked form of King Zodiac. A guard hurriedly draped a fur mantle over his shoulders. Zodiac looked up at the balcony. There stood Briar, her velvet gown torn, her hair wild, holding the wealthiest lord in the south hostage with a terrifyingly beautiful calm. Silas and a squad of guards rushed up the stairs, dragging the weeping Harrington away in iron chains. Briar lowered the dagger, leaning heavily against the stone balustrade. Her adrenaline finally crashing, Zodiac took the steps 3 at a time. When he reached the balcony, he didn't ask for reports. He didn't care about the prisoners. He crossed the distance between them, grabbed Briar by the waist, and pulled her flush against his chest. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a collision of power, ash, and survival, a desperate, bruising claim that spoke of the terror of almost losing her. Briar gasped against his lips, dropping the dagger to fist her hands in the thick fur of his mantle, kissing him back with an equal, ravenous intensity. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting together. You're a menace. Zodiac whispered, Fiers? Genuine smile breaking across his hardened face. I'm your menace. Briar corrected softly, her hazel eyes locking onto his, and for the first time in her life, she knew she wasn't running anymore. She'd found her pack. The snows of Highreach Keep eventually melted, but the kingdom was forever changed. Briar Hayes, the rogue Omega, didn't hang from the battlements. Instead, she stood beside the Alpha King, not as a submissive mate, but as his equal and chief strategist. Together, Zodiac and Briar forged a new era, proving that true power isn't dictated by biology, but by the undeniable strength of a survivor's heart. I don't tell stories to entertain you for 5 minutes and disappear. I tell them because survival, defiance, and the refusal to be broken, those aren't just themes. They're lessons we carry into real life. Every story here is crafted to make you feel something, I think harder, and maybe see yourself differently. 5 takeaway points. The world will try to tell you who you're supposed to be based on what you look like, where you come from, or what box they've built for you. Briar was an Omega biologically wired to submit, to nurture, to stay small. But Cassius saw something else. He saw a stubborn spark in her hazel eyes and decided to train her anyway. Biology said she couldn't, hunger said she had to. And survival doesn't care about the rules. When you're outnumbered and outmatched, you don't win by playing their game. You rewrite it. Briar didn't face the Vanguard head-on with brute strength. She used the terrain, the freezing mud, deadfalls, traps. She lured them into the narrow gorge at Blackwood Ridge and slaughtered them one by one. She fought like a ghost because ghosts don't fight fair. They fight to win. Respect isn't given to the loudest voice in the room. It's earned by the one who proves they can't be ignored. Lord Harrington stood in front of the entire hall and called Briar a feral dog, a breeder who didn't belong. She didn't yell back. She tilted her head and calmly asked why he positioned his supply wagons in the mudflats during monsoon season, losing 3 tons of grain and stalling his own cavalry for 2 weeks. The hall went silent. A pup with a sandbox understands drainage better than your generals. The people who underestimate you aren't your biggest threat. Your biggest threat is believing them. Zodiac could have thrown Briar in the dungeons or mounted her head on the gates like Harrington wanted. Instead, he gave her a mahogany cane, a seat at the War Council, and watched her silently dismantle every flawed strategy the Southern Lords suggested. He saw what no one else did. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a weapon they didn't know how to use yet. Power isn't about who was born into it. It's about who refuses to die without it. Briar stood on that balcony with a torn velvet gown, a healing leg, and Zodiac's dagger pressed to the throat of the wealthiest lord in the South. The rebellion crumbled in seconds. Not because she was the strongest, because she understood something everyone else forgot: survival doesn't bleed. Pride does, and she'd been surviving her whole life.